Welcome to The Critique. The material we're analyzing today uses some really deep Roman history. We're talking triumphs, Diocletian, imperial shifts, to try and make sense of modern politics.
Yeah, specifically looking at the capture of Nicolás Maduro and the political role of Donald Trump. It's a huge canvas.
It is. So let's just jump right in and see if we can strengthen some of the foundations that connect these, vast historical periods.
Sounds good.
All right, so your opening makes a really strong connection between Maduro's public capture and the Roman triumph, but it feels like it stops just short of the real payoff.
Okay.
The argument needs to be elevated, I think, from just a comparison of spectacle to a more formal analysis of ritualized power transfer.
So you're saying the visual is there, but the function isn't fully explored.
Exactly. I mean, from the notes, the argument is that the capture in January 2026, the transport through Manhattan in a van with the doors open, that whole deliberate show of force,
Operation Absolute Resolve, right.
right, that it functions as a modern humiliation spectacle. And visually, I get it. The captured leader, the charges from 2020, it definitely evokes the drama of a triumph.
But that's the weakness, isn't it? If we focus only on the theatrical side of it, the humiliation, we're kind of missing the point of what a triumph actually was for the Romans.
We are, because a Roman triumph wasn't just a parade. It had critical political and, religious functions. It was about granting or confirming legitimacy for the victor. It was about closure.
Not just showing off the vanquished.
That the comparison is wrong. It's incomplete.
Incomplete. Exactly.
So the suggestion would be to shift the analytical weight, move it away from Maduro's personal embarrassment and onto the U.S.'s sort of institutional affirmation.
Yes. Focus on how the American security teams, by making this a global public spectacle, aren't just humiliating him. They are legitimizing the entire outcome of the conflict for everyone watching.
So it becomes an affirmation of sovereign authority, of finality.
That's the pivot. And we can make that really concrete. For instance, you could contrast the temporary nature of the Roman triumph. It's a single day of glory, right? Contrast that with the lasting legal power of federal charges, drug trafficking, narco-terrorism. That shows the difference between classical and modern political finality.
And the ritual itself is different. The Roman triumph ends with a sacrifice, cementing the victor's religious authority.
So what's the modern equivalent?
Well, building on your point, maybe the spectacle of the visible weapons and the open van doors. Maybe that's the substitute for the religious or sacrificial elements.
So the law enforcement action itself becomes the ritual.
Yeah, a state-sanctioned, globally broadcast ritual of jurisdiction.
And the most actionable way to show that would be to connect the transfer to U.S. custody and then the court appearance. That Monday, January 5th court date. That's the real climax.
It replaces the ritual closure of the triumph with legal closure.
The courtroom becomes the modern temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus.
It's the ultimate statement of jurisdiction. Yeah, that gives the whole argument so much more analytical depth. I like that.
Okay, let's move in the second big comparison, the one focusing on Donald Trump and Diocletian.
The culture warriors.
The culture warriors, yeah. It's a clever framing, but I think it can go so much deeper if it integrates the huge structural, constitutional shifts that really define Diocletian's reign.
I do appreciate how the material connects Diocletian's great persecution. His total failure to stop Christianity.
Right, closing churches, seizing property, and then you get a Christian emperor just 20 years later.
And connects that to Trump's fight against political correctness and demographic shifts. The conclusion is that they're both ultimately fighting a losing culture war.
And that framework is clean. But doesn't it feel a little limited? Diocletian wasn't just some culture warrior.
No, not at all.
He basically ended the Roman Republic as it had existed for centuries. So by focusing only on the culture war angle, the analysis misses his most fundamental transformation.
You mean the shift from the princeps to the dominus?
That's it, exactly. The move from first citizen, which kept up the illusion of the Republic, to lord and master, which was, outright monarchical authority.
And that's the structural gap in the argument. The whole Roman political system had been this polite fiction for hundreds of years.
Yeah, that they were just good citizens helping out.
And Diocletian shattered that fiction. Not because he was a tyrant for the sake of it,
but because the crisis of the 3rd century demanded it.
So by missing that transition, the comparison misses a huge opportunity to speculate about whether Trump's actions, whatever his intent, are causing a similar permanent structural shift in American executive power.
Okay, so the suggestion here is to pivot, go from Diocletian's reactive and frankly failed culture war stance to his active role in ending the systemic chaos of the 3rd century crisis.
Which then lets you more critically ask if Trump, who is often seen as this chaotic figure, is inadvertently driving a permanent structural change in what the presidency even is.
We'd have to frame that as highly speculative, of course.
Of course, but that fits the ambition of the piece. To make it concrete, you could introduce the princeps to Dominus transition and highlight how Diocletian, gave the unified empire another century or so of life through radical centralization.
The tetrarchy, the currency reforms, all of it was a direct response to total collapse.
And you use that to ask if Trump's resistance to norms, as messy as it is accidentally accelerating a shift in the perceived authority of the U.S. executive. It just adds so much more intellectual weight.
You could also build on the idea that Diocletian ended the Roman civil wars of that century, the endless cycle of warlords and barracks emperors.
Right.
And then suggest that the reader should explore whether Trump's actions, through their sheer disruptiveness, are clearing a path for a different, maybe more centralized or even imperial form of leadership, regardless of his own short-term failures.
That's the critical link. You explicitly connect the systemic crisis Diocletian faced to the feeling of political instability being discussed today. It adds a gravity that goes way beyond just ideological conflict.
The analogy moves from culture warrior to systemic catalyst. Precisely.
If you stop at the culture war, Diocletian is basically an ancient Pat Buchanan. But if you bring in the Dominus shift, he becomes this figure of profound structural transformation. And that's a much more interesting and frankly worthy comparison.
Okay, that brings us to the overall architecture of the piece, the structure.
Yeah, because the material has these two really powerful narratives of historical cleanup. You have Diocletian ending the 3rd century crisis, and then you have Trump, unintentionally, ending the myth of Southern nobility.
But they're presented one after the other, sequentially. They're not really woven into a single overarching argument.
And that's the final step to elevating this whole piece. I mean, that section on the U.S. Civil War was fascinating. The idea that the shooting stopped in 1865, but the, quote, civil war over the Civil War just kept going.
Right, sustained by what the text calls the bullshit story of Southern honor.
Crafted by elites like Woodrow Wilson, yeah. And the core idea is that Trump's bluntness is now accelerating this process of abandonment. It's making the myth's ugly core obvious.
Which the material calls a reason for profound hope.
It's a very powerful idea. And the piece concludes that Trump is Diocletian, because he's fighting a losing culture war, and he is unintentionally clearing out the debris from a much older civil war as well.
But that connection, the link between Roman Empire stabilization and American myth demolition, it's asserted, but it's not fully established, is it?
No, it's not. The reader needs a stronger thematic thread that links Diocletian's historical significance, ending chaos, with Trump's claimed significance, destroying this unifying, if racist, myth.
So the big suggestion here is to adopt a structural framework that centers on one idea: unintentional historical acceleration.
Tell me more.
The idea that certain figures, often the ones fighting change the hardest, actually become the catalyst for the system's purification, or for its next transformation.
And that framework could unify all three major comparisons: the Maduro spectacle, the Diocletian shift, and the collapse of the Southern myth. It becomes the intellectual engine for the whole thesis.
Exactly. You need to dedicate a section to defining that mechanism. What does this acceleration actually look like?
It looks like aggressive resistance paradoxically speeding up the very thing you're resisting. The political system purifying itself through the stressor.
So, for example, both Diocletian with his great persecution and Trump with his, bluntness making the Southern myth untenable. They both used extreme actions that inadvertently sped up the changes they wanted to stop.
And the Diocletian analogy provides the historical weight to make that argument really resonate.
That's the engine of the entire piece. You could even use the argument about the Southern myth creating a, quote, unified culture for the United States as a counterpoint to Diocletian's own attempt to enforce unity through the old gods.
Highlighting the cost of maintaining stability through a cultural myth, whether it's ancient Rome or 19th century America. I love that.
So the final structural point is to reorganize the narrative flow.
Mm-hmm.
Put the princeps to dominus shift right before the U.S. Civil War myth discussion. That way you frame both of them as these necessary, maybe violent or uncomfortable, transitions away from an unsustainable model.
That gives the whole piece a really powerful, coherent arc. It's all about transformation, not just a series of interesting but separate examples. It takes the argument and gives it the historical and philosophical weight it's reaching for.
Exactly.
Okay, so that brings us to our key takeaways, the actionable roadmap for this material.
Right. So first, on the Maduro critique, the key is to distinguish spectacle from political ritual. Elevate it from just a humiliation display to a modern affirmation of sovereign jurisdiction.
And use the legal finality of the U.S. court system as the modern replacement for the ritual closure of the Roman triumph.
Second, for the Trump-Diocletian comparison, move beyond the culture war. Bring in the profound structural shift from princeps to dominus.
Yeah, analyze Trump not just as an ideological combatant, but as a potential catalyst for a permanent change in executive power, using the third century crisis as the backdrop.
And finally, the biggest challenge is structural. Weave those two cleanup narratives, the Roman stabilization and the destruction of the Southern myth, into one single cohesive thesis.
An overarching thesis about unintentional political acceleration and transformation.
And make sure you define that mechanism clearly and let it guide the entire flow of the piece.
Your insights here are genuinely provocative. Strengthening the structural and functional analysis is really going to amplify their impact. We look forward to seeing the refined version.